Welcome to this presentation, Lobbying by Nonprofits and Charities, What Nonprofits and Charities Need to Know When Lobbying Across Canada. This presentation has been prepared by IntegralOrg with funding provided by the CBA Law for the Future Fund. IntegralOrg is a registered charity that provides support and education for nonprofits and charities. At IntegralOrg, your mission is ours. We help organizations build capacity to carry out their missions through education and support in foundational areas like governance, legal compliance, financial management, strategic planning, and risk management. After watching this presentation, nonprofits and charities should be able to answer two key questions. First, what is lobbying? And second, does anyone in my organization have to register when doing any lobbying activity in Canada? For Canadian nonprofits and charities, knowing when they are lobbying and if they have to register is complicated. This is because each jurisdiction in Canada, federal, provincial, or territorial, has its own lobbying legislation, requirements, and exemptions. From jurisdiction to jurisdiction, the lobbying legislation varies, including who must register and what rules, if any, apply to charities and nonprofits. This presentation provides important information about lobbying and registration relevant to and directed specifically at nonprofits and charities. We've also created helpful documents, including a lobbying jurisdiction chart that summarizes important information about lobbying and a document for each jurisdiction that outlines some of the relevant provisions of lobbying legislation in that jurisdiction. These documents are located just below the link to this video at www.integralorg.ca. Of course, organizations should always consult the lobbying legislation itself. See the documents for each jurisdiction for links to lobbying legislation. First off, it is important to understand what is lobbying. Many nonprofits and charities in Canada are involved in lobbying, some without even knowing it. Statutes across jurisdictions in Canada generally define lobbying as communication with a public office holder in an attempt to influence the legislative process, including the awarding of any grant, contribution, or other financial benefit. Clearly, to understand lobbying and to know whether your nonprofit or charity is involved in lobbying, it is important to understand what a public office holder is. A public office holder is generally defined as an elected member of Parliament, member of the Legislative Assembly or territorial government, or a member of the public office holder's staff, or an employee, officer, director, or member of any department of the public office holder, or an individual appointed to any board, committee, or council by the public office holder. A public office holder is at times referred to as a POH. Knowing the legislation that applies to your organization's situation is important. It is especially important to know about the exemptions that may apply to some nonprofits and charities. For example, lobby legislation in some jurisdictions like Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Quebec exempt a nonprofit or charity organization completely unless it is constituted to serve employer, union, or professional interests, or having a majority of members that are profit-seeking enterprises or representatives of profit-seeking enterprises. So, if a nonprofit in these jurisdictions serves employer, union, or professional interests, for example, a union organization or a professional association, the organization is not exempt. Or, if a nonprofit has a majority of members who are for-profit companies or representatives of for-profit companies, for example, a nonprofit whose membership is mostly made up of for-profit sponsors, this organization is not exempt. In some jurisdictions, it is important for a nonprofit or charity that has members to know who their members are to understand if the organization is exempt from lobbying legislation or not. Refer to the lobbying jurisdiction chart and the documents on each jurisdiction that accompany this presentation to find out more about exemptions for nonprofits and charities and how they may apply to your organization. A question that some organizations have is, which jurisdictions do I have to register in? Is it the jurisdiction my nonprofit is located in, or the jurisdiction where we do the lobbying? It is not the location of your nonprofit organization that matters, but which government your organization is lobbying. If you are lobbying the federal government, you would have to register federally if you meet the minimum requirements to register. If your organization is lobbying a provincial government, you would have to register in that province, again, if you meet the minimum requirements to register. Some municipalities also have their own lobbying registration requirements. It is important to understand lobbying, the lobbying legislation that applies where your organization lobbies, and the requirements for registration as a lobbyist, because there are significant consequences of not registering that can include fines, imprisonment, and prohibitions from lobbying. Who is a lobbyist? There are two kinds of lobbyists that need to know the registration requirements where they plan to lobby. Canadian nonprofits and charities at times may hire a consultant lobbyist from a lobbying firm. A consultant lobbyist is a professional lobbyist who is engaged to lobby on behalf of an organization, such as a business, nonprofit, or charity. Registration is the responsibility of the consultant lobbyist and not the nonprofit or charity that engaged the lobbyist. Alternatively, a nonprofit or charity may decide to do its own lobbying and not hire anyone external to the organization. This type of lobbyist is called an in-house lobbyist. Generally, for the purposes of legislation and registration, an in-house or organization lobbyist is someone who works for a compensation for a nonprofit or charity, for example, a paid employee. This means that a volunteer, such as a volunteer board member, is generally not considered a lobbyist and not required to register. We know that lobbying definitions often include communicating with a public office holder about the awarding of any grant, contribution, or other financial benefit. But is applying for a grant lobbying? No, simply applying for a grant is not lobbying. However, in some jurisdictions, if an organization sets up a meeting with a public office holder to try and influence the outcome of the grant awarding process, this is lobbying. Is meeting with a public office holder to discuss work that your organization does lobbying? No, it is not lobbying to meet with a public office holder simply to introduce your organization and the work it does. But in some jurisdictions, it is lobbying if one of the purposes of the meeting is to try and convince the public office holder that your organization should receive funding. What types of activities are considered lobbying? Lobbying activities generally include not only the actual meeting with a public office holder, but also time spent preparing for the meeting. As an example, a 1-hour meeting with a public office holder may require several hours of preparation for activities like planning, researching, writing, editing, rewriting, compiling, prepping, and traveling. All of this time is considered to have been spent lobbying. There is another activity other than meeting with a public office holder that is often considered lobbying, grassroots lobbying. Though there are some differences between jurisdictions, generally grassroots lobbying is defined as any appeals to members of the public through the mass media or by direct communication that seek to persuade those members of the public to communicate directly with a public office holder in an attempt to place pressure on the public office holder to endorse a particular opinion. Nonprofits and charities can carry out a grassroots lobbying campaign through various methods. For example, they might appeal to the public via letter and email campaigns, advertisements, their websites, or social media accounts. Activities that are counted as lobbying in grassroots communication can include researching, drafting, preparing content and materials, managing the project, advising, responding to correspondence and phone calls, editing, approving, disseminating content and materials, presenting, and more. Does my organization have to register? Whether or not your organization has to register depends on the legislation of the jurisdiction you are lobbying in. As noted, in some jurisdictions, there are exemptions that apply to nonprofits or charities. There may also be other qualifications and registration thresholds. It is important to be aware of all of these for the jurisdiction your organization is lobbying in. In some jurisdictions, an organization lobbyist has to register only if a threshold, generally stated in terms of hours spent lobbying over a period of time, is reached. In other jurisdictions, the 20% rule, as it is commonly known, applies. The 20% rule comes from federal lobbying legislation. Under the Federal Lobbying Act, registration is required when lobbying activities undertaken by paid employees of organizations, including grassroots lobbying, constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee, or would constitute a significant part of the duties of one employee were they performed by one employee. To find out which threshold applies to your organization, refer to the documents that accompany this presentation. It is clear that for nonprofits and charities involved in lobbying, keeping accurate records of time spent on activities considered lobbying is important, so that your organization knows when the threshold for registering has been reached. Once your organization or charity has reached the time threshold for registration, there is a requirement to register within a specific time frame. Under the Federal Lobbying Act, for example, your organization has 2 months from the date on which your organization meets the registration threshold to register. The time frame varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. As for who is responsible for registering, typically it is the most senior paid employee in your organization who is responsible to register. The registration process differs from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Once your organization has registered, reports must be submitted regularly. In summary, nonprofits and charities need to know which jurisdiction is my organization lobbying in. In that jurisdiction, is my kind of organization exempt from complying with lobbying law? What exactly constitutes lobbying in that jurisdiction? And how and when does my organization comply with any registration requirements? For more information about lobbying and registration in each jurisdiction in Canada, refer to the documents that accompany this presentation. As noted, for Canadian nonprofits and charities, knowing when they are lobbying and if they have to register is complicated because each jurisdiction in Canada has its own lobbying legislation, requirements, and exemptions. This lobbying jurisdiction chart shows a quick view of information about lobbying in jurisdictions in Canada. A PDF of this chart can be found with the documents that accompany this presentation. It is clear that organizations are not left out of the lobbying legislation simply because they are charities or nonprofits. It is also clear that each jurisdiction has differing exemptions and registration thresholds. Something that is similar between jurisdictions, however, is that there are penalties associated with not registering when an organization should have. If you think organizations in Canada should have certainty about their obligations as they lobby from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, perhaps one place to start is by asking the Uniform Law Conference of Canada to consider harmonization of provincial and territorial lobbying laws. The ULCC was founded to harmonize the laws of the provinces and territories of Canada, and, where appropriate, the federal laws as well. Their website is www.ulcc.ca. Thank you for watching this IntegralOrg presentation on lobbying. After completing this presentation and reviewing the helpful documents, you should have the basics to begin to ensure that your nonprofit or charity understands what lobbying is and what it needs to do to be compliant with lobbying legislation. If you have any further questions about lobbying legislation, contact information for jurisdictions is provided here.